thank you for doing reading and coming. I appreciate it very much. I will say that kindergartner who went to Shamrock Gardens back all those years ago just recently graduated from Northwest School of the Arts, went all the way through CMS, is headed to Washington State to go to college this fall. So you might keep your thoughts and say a prayer for he and his family as he but it's been a great experience all around. I understand that, you know, Gail told me that this was sort of partly a summing up. You've been going through the book and hearing from a lot of people. And so I thought that what I would do here is just give you what I see as my summary, or some of my summary of what I think is, what I think you can get out of the book, the big picture, what message I think, and then you can have discussion, questions, etc. But I start with 3 quotes that I think really speak to the 3 issues that I think are most important. This is the first one from Madge Hopkins, who was in 1960. We were separate and we were not equal, but I didn't know it, and I'm glad they didn't tell me. The next one is from the yearbook in 1971, when desegregation had just begun. Realizing that to change things for the better, everyone must do something. We, the staff, the W.C. Lyon, that was the yearbook, would like to make a suggestion: come together. At first glance, that may seem simple enough, but it is really a tremendous task. It means giving of oneself, sharing with others, investigating the problems of our society, and finding workable solutions. And then the third quote is from William Hamlin. He said this in 1998. He was a 1965 graduate of West Charlotte, and his children also went to the integrated West Charlotte. And in 1998, he says, I was part of this belief that if we could all integrate, that there was just going to be a natural exchange of knowledge and resources and that sort of thing. But our society is very weak. And as new demands come upon us for changing, we find new ways to entrench ourselves in the old. His hopes for resegregation at that point had not been realized. In fact, we've seen backsliding, as you see within the book. And so that was sort of his looking back on that in 1998. And those 3 quotes showcase what I think are 3 key issues. The first being showcasing that we weren't equal, but they didn't tell me, and I'm glad they didn't. Showcases the efforts made by many different people over many years to nurture young people at West Charlotte High School in segregation, in desegregation, resegregation, such like pictures of teachers from the segregated era. I hope you enjoyed reading about the school during that time. These people had that. It was wonderful. But they have worked in an ever-changing array of circumstances, and it's important to realize that that is something that has gone on throughout West Charlotte. The second theme, as the West Charlotte Lions, one of the yearbook editors pointed out, emphasizes people's capacity for working together to right long-standing wrongs. And this is one of my favorite pictures, one of my favorite stories is Sam Haywood and Bertie Bryce. When Sam Haywood came to the school, tried to put away the historical pictures because he thought that would give them a better start at a new school. And Bertie Bryce, the longtime teacher, came to him and said, Mr. Haywood, you've got to put those pictures back. We have to build on the past. And he listened to her. He was willing to admit he had been wrong. And he listened to her. That, I think, is so important. Speaking about it, it's not easy. I mean, you didn't just put people together and they just got along. There was a lot that they had to discuss. There had to be a lot of sharing of oneself, as the students said. And when they did decide to do that, decide to share, I think as the book shows, they accomplished an enormous amount. You know, a lot could happen. To see some students there. People put the children on the bus. They gave of themselves, they shared, they investigated, and many young African Americans did gain new opportunities, thrive, and achieve. white students gained new opportunities to thrive and achieve, and the city became a better, fairer place. And as I said in the book, actually when I started the book, that's the story I was going to tell, because Charlotte was still immigrated when I started the book, and I thought that was important. People had to know integration was under challenge, and I thought it was so important for people to know that it had worked and it was a positive thing. So that was very important. But then there's the tough part. The latter sections of the book make it clear how difficult it really is to right all wrongs. As William Hamlin said, I just thought once we got together, everything would get fixed. And obviously, that's not what happened. And we know that now in the story of West Charlotte High School. And I really had to come to terms with that as I watched everything come apart and really starting to think about what does that mean, what's the bigger picture. Desegregation means something very different when it doesn't last. And that's a really hard. So scholars of the civil rights movement all across the country are have been working to try to see how do I come to terms with seeing what were gains of the movement being rolled back. What then does the story mean? And that's something we're all still trying to think about. But one of the things that it does mean, and go back to William Hamlin saying our society is very witty, is that the divides that were produced by centuries of what I think is in a difficult way but fairly called white supremacy and all its manifestations were still in people's hearts. They didn't just vanish away. And they were woven deep into the social and economic fabric. All of that just created a society where the idea that white people were better and deserved more than black people was just deeply in the society. So even when schools were segregated, even though tons of progress got made, lots of people learned, lots of things happened, other divides actually increased. And the important ones are the physical divides. And I think these two maps just say so much. If you look at it, they're in the book. Darker, higher percentage of African Americans. 1970 on the left, where when they started Bushwell High School, Myers Park, Providence, you guys right around here, I think, right up there, becomes not less segregated, but more segregated. You get this, the way that the city developed. Money and investment went into these new areas, the suburban areas of town, this part of town, as you can all see, both private money and public money to build the roads and the sewers. The center city areas, the older areas of town, were essentially neglected. And because of a historic gap based in redlining, based in in ways that loans were made and wages and all these other things, who had the money to buy new homes in new areas. Most of those people were white. Some were African American, but most were white. So when you get this divide physically, the city becomes, even as the schools are integrated, more divided physically, both by wealth and by color. And you actually see today, I don't know how many of y'all saw today's Observer. Look, I might have to show Observer, but you know, the whole question of redevelopment of former Brooklyn neighborhoods stirs debate on reparations. I mean, there was a historical wrong done when Center City black communities were bulldozed without proper recompense to the people who were living in them for both physical capital and the social capital that was destroyed when neighborhoods were torn apart. So what do we do that has had a long-standing effect on how well people have done in our society here in Charlotte? So it's an important question. Because you had urban renewal, highway construction, you had when they expanding and increasingly violent drug trade comes to Charlotte. It's concentrated in those city neighborhoods. It's sort of allowed to be concentrated in those city neighborhoods. and the response to the war on drugs, and the jailing of large numbers of young black men after that. These are things that have happened since all the laws were repealed. These are things that have happened since the schools became integrated. So, and you see in all of these, this tenacious legacy of white supremacy. You also see the re-emergence, I think, of a lot of the old kinds of stereotypes about African Americans as being uncivilized, out of control, needing to be controlled, particularly focused now on young urban black men, not as broad as it used to be, but very definitely stereotype. So when busing ends, you look at this picture, you have a combination of physical separation and a fear of and lack of respect for people living in these low-income neighborhoods, and everybody confused and get what we get into is a very divided school system. It happens very quickly. And I think, who was here, who was here when that happened?
In what happened?
When the resegregation, when they stopped busing and resegregated? What did you think about that? I mean, did you expect, is that what you thought was going to happen?
1990s?
Yeah, late 90s? You were ready for it to be quickly resegregated?
I expected what happened to be what was going to happen. I wasn't for it, but I thought it was just going to be segregated schools.
Was it because of the push for neighborhood schools again? Is that,
Well, I think Amy, I don't know if Amy talked about this last time, but there's a combination of, well, people want to send their children to good schools that they think are safe. And so, to be honest, if they're far away, but they're good and safe, people don't mind sending them, or they perceive them. So it's a combination of people wanted, you like to have a child go to school close to home, but then also if you perceive that those schools are better schools than the school down, over in the center city, you're not going to want to send your child there. You're going to want to pull away. And people will often send their schools, you have kids to schools that are farther away because they perceive them as being, safer or better. So it's a combination of physical distance, I think, and also concerns about its risk. I think that's pretty clear. It's a combination of those two things that contributed to. So it's the physical structure, but it's also how people feel about, and not that necessarily people, not like this not like we see today in more dramatic manifestations, but just a feeling that, well, it's just not as good there. Those things aren't as good. Those kids aren't as, et cetera, yeah.
So I don't know if we're at a discussion stage here, but what I wanted to, on that point, to mention is that it's in your book, and I'd love to hear you say more about it. This was not like the end of busing didn't sound from the approach to be some kind of purely local initiative. There seems to be a national movement. The litigants had support from out of state, from big money people who wanted to bring this about nationwide. And if I was going to summarize sort of the gist of your book, I think I've done this to my wife because she hasn't read it yet, is that, there was segregation, but there were a lot of good things going on in the black community. There was desegregation, and there were all these benefits to the community of that. And then Reagan happened. I mean, that's kind of the way it is in the book, and it's on page 112 if y'all want to look, because I marked it this morning to look back, because it was such a pivotal moment in reading the book for me that, okay, he came to town and knocked busing, and the crowd went quiet, but the initiative continued, and it continued through the federal government, and it continued through these private groups that wanted to change things back. And so I feel like, do you agree that the community of Charlotte was manipulated by forces outside of the community and outside of the state during that period when things slid back?
It's a combination. I mean, I think one of the things I'd like to think about the book is that it really does emphasize, I mean, you got it, that what happens in the whole country, we're affected by that. But who's president really, really matters. In terms of legal, in terms of setting tone. I mean, it's a huge difference, and I think Reagan was a watershed. It was the shift from, we're really, as a country and as a community, going to take serious action to right these old wrongs, to say, okay, well, we're done with that. done all we could, and we'll, move forward, and now we'll go back, we'll focus more on the individual, more on what, choices you can make depending on whether you have money and those kinds of things. So I think you're absolutely correct about that. And Charlotte is, number one, you have to understand, Charlotte was kind of unusual. The degree of desegregation and support for desegregation, there weren't a whole lot of places, there weren't a whole lot of places that had that nationally, even to start with. And so that's we're already kind of bucking a trend. And Charlotte keeps its desegregation longer than almost anybody else. But eventually these forces, and you do get these, we're affected by these bigger things that are happening that create these divides. We're affected by the changing law. Reagan appoints a conservative judge to hear the case. We're affected by people who are coming from other places who don't, who haven't experienced desegregation. So there is a lot of coming in. We're affected, frankly, because one of the impulses to desegregate was that it won us kudos on the national front. That we were the city that made it work, and that was very positive for the business community. By the late 80s, 90s, making desegregation work doesn't get you that same kind of, so there is all of this stuff coming on, and we have, yes.
I came down from Boston 25 years ago, and I lived in inner city Boston, where not only was segregation and busing in the schools started, and I was teaching in public schools. So that had a dramatic effect on me as a teacher, because initially half the kids didn't want to be there that were black. And they were throwing spit wads at my back when I would turn towards the chalkboard, and there was no help from the principals because they really weren't a part of it either. But what I saw was the neighborhoods were already segregated. And I wanted to see if you would speak to the combination and the importance of not only segregating the schools, but to me, more importantly, is segregating the neighborhoods. Because in the larger cities that I've experienced, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, the younger people in those cities are so familiar with seeing people of color in their neighborhoods that it's much easier for them to accept them in the school system. And I think that's where our hope lies. My son married an African-American woman because he was with African-Americans in the inner city. A white young man down here in Charlotte today would probably be much less likely to marry an African-American woman because they don't live around him.
Well, if they live out here, maybe, different. But you also get, and I'll be honest, when people get the kids, I was going to bring this up as one of the things that I think is so important to do, and we're talking about what can we do now. It's so important to call out when people are, raise those old stereotypes, talk about particularly parents. I was talking to a young man, very liberal, all of this. He said, well, he's talking about how very far left, he's like way on the left. But then he was mentioning how he and his wife had moved basically to this area of town because the schools were good because the parents cared. So he's got, he doesn't have trouble seeing, he's not like, he doesn't go running, screaming when he sees a black person he actually deals with, but he still has this perception that out here, parents are different. They're different kind of people from the people who are in Center City. And so he moved out here. So I do think that young people have open minds more so, but they are also affected by these forces and these expectations. It's important to really keep on doing that. And let me, in that vein, let me just give you a couple of quick thoughts I have in terms of what to do, and then we'll open it back up for the rest of the discussion. Because I do think it's important, and I like to put these are some West Charlotte graduates, this is from 2010, because kids still, West Charlotte really struggles. They have a lot of opposition, they have a lot of obstacles to overcome, but kids still succeed. There are still people who care, kids still succeed, they graduate, they go to college, they don't all, not as many as should, as we'd like to, not as many as have the potential. But, you know, there's a lot of great kids in there, and I just like to emphasize that, so I put this slide up. But it is really important to keep working at this. Some of these things seem really big. I mean, like this whole wealth gap and all of this. That's why, again, thinking about reparations, you know, what do you do structurally? Because it's so important to understand that there are these fundamental structural problems in, you know, where we are. And it's going to require not only working to build connections and understanding and doing the hard work, which isn't just meeting each other, but is this sustained contact where you're giving, sharing, and investigating the problems of society together. I mean, that's what, going back to that kind of work is tremendously important. But it's also important to acknowledge that righting these wrongs will require significant disruption of social and economic patterns that destabilize families in the center city and that isolate children in struggling neighborhoods, as you know, at the lower rungs of the economy. Our society has a fundamental mismatch between wages, housing, opportunity. I mean, there's just a fundamental mismatch, and healthcare. So that's a big job, and it takes a lot of steady work on a lot of fronts, and I want to sort of just encourage that. And things like supporting the creation of a living wage so that people can afford things. Supporting the expansion of Medicare or Medicaid here in the state so that people have, you know, getting families some things they can have more stability, can live in more stable circumstances in more prosperous parts of town. Support efforts to create more affordable housing, especially in better off areas where the kids can go to schools that don't struggle so much. That's, you know, that's a tough sell in places like this. I mean, there's a lot of opposition, but it's just so important to do that. Support efforts to help families stay in the gentrifying communities. We were talking about Cherry. You know, right now one of the challenges, even in these communities, people are struggling, but there's a social fabric. But as gentrification is happening, people are getting displaced again. People who got displaced from the center city during urban renewal are now getting displaced from the other neighborhoods, again, creating instability. Children need stability, love, support. And a lot of them are living in circumstances where it's very hard to find that because they're moving around all the time. So ways to do that, ways to support also the people who are doing the work now. I mean, you want to look at these bigger things, but also support ways that connections are being built in schools. Support those teachers who are working in schools with struggling kids. Support the kids lower income kids who are in better off schools, who often need some extra, you know, it's easy, one of the things you see in West Shore, it's easy for them to kind of get overlooked. Okay, you're in a good school now, we won't worry about you, and not necessarily give them the kind of support that they need to really thrive, making sure that their needs are met. Support efforts to build community connections in diverse and in diversifying neighborhoods. I think that that's also, I mean, it really is both this social fabric, you said, building connections through sustained effort and figuring out some ways to, bit by bit, work on some of these economic divides that create so much instability. I mean, these are very important. And it's a big job, and right now it doesn't seem nationally all that helpful, all that promising. But one of the things you learn from history that I think is very important is you always have to be working to do what you can. For years and years and years, from the 19-teens up into the 50s, there wasn't a lot of prospect for civil rights, good stuff to happen, civil rights. But people kept working, and when the situation changed, when the sort of zeitgeist shifted, people were ready to take advantage because they've been working, they've been building, and particularly sort of building connections. And I think that's tremendously important to do now, so that those are in place, and what progress can be made is made, so that if there is a bigger kind of shift, we're ready to move it in the direction that it needs to. Those are sort of some of my thoughts. But now I'd open it up for thoughts, questions, ideas.
So one thing I'd love to hear you talk about, and I thought about this a lot reading the book, and it was based on a comment that somebody had made about how they weren't sure whether some of these problems that the schools were addressing through desegregation and that they're not addressing anymore really in that same way, is that this person wasn't sure whether those were issues that the schools should be, that we should expect schools to solve. And what was interesting to me about that, I honestly think that that reflects kind of, not to pick on my friend of white privilege and kind of bias, because the notion that all schools do is just teach subject matter is kind of just a displaced notion in my opinion. I've never taught in a school, but I have 4 kids who've all gone through school. I went through school here in Charlotte during this era. And then my kids were born right as resegregation was occurring, and so we happened to live out here, really, truly just happened to. We didn't pick this. It's like great grandpa's house was out in the middle of Valentine, so we moved out there because there was a house there for us to live in with our family, but it wasn't an intentional choice that we want to live in the white suburbs, because I grew up in one of these schools, right, Piedmont Middle School and stuff. But I believe if teachers are just teaching their subject, I mean, anybody who asks it, I would just be interested to hear from the teachers even. Do you just teach your subject, or do you work with kids in other ways? Because it feels like a position of white privilege to say, well, all my kid needs is for the teacher to teach the subject, and all these other things are distractions. But the West Charlotte, in the way you picture it in the book, was this wonderful community resource, and continues to be to some extent, but it was in that really good period.
Well, I think there's a couple pieces to that. Or you want to speak directly to that?
Yes, I was a teacher in Indiantown, Florida, many years ago, high poverty school. We wanted to teach our kids well and have them achieve, but we knew the community they lived in, poor, Black, Hispanic, working class, white. And so we came up with Moorfield dollars. I designed a dollar, and we printed it out, and we used to reward our kids for good behavior, good work. And then I got people in my mother's church to donate or make clothing and other items, and we created a store. And the kids got to run the store and got to buy things, and they were buying things as Christmas presents for their family. They were working hard to earn the money, and they were getting something that would help their families. Just one idea.
Well, and I think you're so right. They don't. No, teachers, there's 2 things. There's first of all, the school just can't do it all. And then there are people who say, well, it's really up to the school to make sure these kids succeed, and that's so the school has to do more than teach, but it can't do everything. I mean, that's one thing you learn. It's got to have, for that school to really nurture children, there needs to be a whole support network. Those kids need a network in the school and outside the school, and ideally connections between that school and their communities in order to be in the position to really thrive and really take advantage. So in that sense, it's kind of both and, absolutely. But yeah, this whole idea that all teachers do is teach just makes no sense. But on the other hand, they can't solve alone the problems of the society either. It's got to be this comprehensive. Yeah, you're in that.
I was just going to say to Chris's point, if you go to a school with a lot of white privileged children, those are probably some of the neediest parents out there as far as emailing the teacher and asking for some special, their child needs an extra hug this morning because they had a bad thing happen the night before or whatever. So the idea that somehow other schools, that white privileged schools, that the teachers are just teaching math and science. Teachers are called to be all sorts of things.
Yeah, and the kids out here have challenges, they're different challenges, but they definitely have other kinds of challenges.
I was just going to say that you were allowed to do that because you had support from the top. If you don't have support from the top, you don't have anything. 40-something years ago, when I first started teaching out in Union County, and it was very rural, I had a lot of poor kids in my class, and some of them didn't actually bathe or brush their teeth or anything. Anyway, we had a nurse come in. She gave everybody in the class toothbrushes, and I had Dudley make like, so that when we came back from lunch, every 2 by 2, they could go back to the sink and brush their teeth. My principal made me stop that program.
Because I got mine.
Yeah, so.
Well, I think it's, again,
I think our society has a tendency to kind of pigeonhole things. It's like one of the things, well, if we're going to solve this problem, well, what's the one thing we can do that can be the most effective, or cost effective time? It's this kind of efficiency where if you focus on one piece, like your principles, like, well, you're supposed to teach, right, this whole like other stuff. But children need, again, this broad range of support. It's not, you can't focus in on one thing. You can't focus in on another thing, which makes it hard, for if you say, well, what will I do? Because there's so much that needs to be done. And I think one of the things, to do is to pick something, one piece of it, and really dig in on it. Really work on and then if other people are working on other pieces, there's a whole, well, like these folks who are doing this reparations, they're really digging in on what is this piece of the history? What do we learn from this piece of the history? What can we do if we're thinking about how do we make up for this one thing? There's lots of other stuff, but really get in there, make connections with people, again, investigate together the problems of society. And of course, that's the hardest part, is getting those sustained connections. Oh, here,
yeah, I just wanted to say that also, I think one thing we can do is support funding for those special services that allow teachers to teach. We're getting rid of a lot of, we're so focused on teaching reading, and everybody should, absolutely, it's important, but all those special areas have been cut in order to reduce class size in the lower grade levels. And I don't know how it stands now, but I went to a PTA meeting at Providence Spring, and they said that because our people in Raleigh have decided that K through 2, I guess, has to have small class size, that now the third, fourth, the fourth grade classes, they said one teacher would be assigned like 40 students. And I don't know if any of you have kids at Providence Spring, but that is what they said at the PTA meeting.
well, and I think
It's happening elsewhere.
I'm sure it's statewide, because again, it's this idea, well, we'll target and have small classes, which is actually a very good thing, K through 2. But we won't spend any more money to do it, we'll just take away, again, this sort of, that you focus on one thing to the exclusion of others, and that's what I just want to keep urging is, and if those people who put that in had actual connections with teachers and students and such, and that's another thing, the legislature matters a lot, who's in the legislature matters a lot, our current folks who run Phil Berger, folks who run the legislature, they don't care about kids, I'm sorry, they don't. If they did, they would do care about poor words. They don't care. And that is not helpful.
Since we're sitting in a church building, I'd like to talk about how you feel about how religion and corporate worship should respond to this. Like, is there a moral reason that basically an all-white church in Southeast Charlotte should feel like they're responsible to help enculturate blacks into our church, or us sharing things with black churches? Because I think our churches speak to what's happening in our schools and in our neighborhoods. And you can't find, there's one Presbyterian church downtown Charlotte that's totally enculturated black and white, and I've been to it, and it's rousing worship. But a lot of our white churches in the suburbs, there's no way they'd want to invite black choirs to sing back and forth. And I feel in some ways there is a moral obligation that we owe our black brothers and sisters who worship the same God that we do to try and enculturate the churches if we're going to do that in the schools.
Well, again, the thing is that what does that entail? If it really entails exchange and understanding each other.
And where do you start? How do you go about
those
doing
kinds
that?
of things, I think. that's really important. I mean, I'm not a minister, or I can't speak to sort of how one goes about it, but I think, again, I just want to really focus on real exchange where people are really listening to each other and really saying, okay, well, what can we do? I mean, more of getting to know each other is understanding the problems of society. What's really a problem? You know, what are they really dealing with, these struggling schools? What are they really dealing with? How can we participate? How can we help? How can we support in, you know, ways? Of course, Christ Lutheran is a great example. They have put a huge amount of effort into McClintock Middle School. They have a marvelous group of programs. I think they really understand what's going on. And but it is a big, big endeavor. It's just terrific. But that's a great example of, they haven't necessarily integrated their service, but many of them have come to understand and work with the schools and these families and make a big difference through a long-term, engaged kind of work. So that's the other kind of thing that I think one can reach out in, you know, in ways other than just like sending money here, which doesn't hurt. Was there another, were you gonna, did you have?
I used to be a PTA secretary in Gainesville, Florida, and we had a superintendent who did something daring and controversial, because one of the things that makes a good school good is a strong PTA, and PTA can make a big difference money-wise, but all PTAs and schools aren't created equal, and I knew for teaching in Indiantown that it's very difficult for people in the poor community struggling with the jobs that they have, seasonal migrant workers, to come to a PTA meeting in the evening. So the PTAs tend to be small and you know, fundraising, how much fundraising do you get from people who have very little? So this superintendent in Gainesville decided to redistribute all of the PTA money. And so all the money that you generated, well, you got to keep a little of it, but a big pot of it went into a common pot and got redistributed to all the schools so that the poor schools would have some of the benefits of an active, wealthier school PTA. I mean, I'm sure that's not being done anymore, but there are a lot of ideas out there, redistribution.
Why do you say you sure it's not being done?
Maybe it has been done.
No, I mean, I was just kind of curious as to why you feel like it's not being done.
Oh, I don't know that it stopped. I mean, I moved away, so I don't know. There were a lot of opinions.
Well, it is, again, this is this whole sense of this gets back to, and there have been arguments about that here too. You know, some people saying, well, this is my money and I want to give it to my child's school, and I don't think that, you know, you should take that away. But part of it gets to, again, what are the broader historical forces that have made it possible for you to achieve to the point where you can give $1,000 to your child's PTA. You know, what is that beyond your own hard work? You know, is it, and to really come to terms with that the reason that there are PTAs that have a lot of money and PTAs that don't. You know, again, it's not just because the people who belong to this PTA just work hard in their lives and the people in this PTA. There are some fundamental historical reasons why hard work paid off more handsomely for certain people, mostly white people, than it did for African Americans. And if you think about, you know, that way, then that's how you can start, you know, thinking about redistribution, not as redistribution or sort of reparations, but understanding why, sharing, reaching out, all of that is. I think one of the most dangerous things about all of this is how easy these divides make it for people who are privileged to sort of say, well, those people over there, well, you know, if they'd only work hard, or if they'd only made better decisions, or if they only cared about their kids more, they would, you know, be, you know, things are kind of how they're supposed to be. Things would be better. That it's sort of their fault that they are where they are, or that they're so different from us. Their kids don't really need everything our kids do, so they're not really the same, but it's really okay because their kids really need to learn to read, whereas ours need the math and the hands-on science and all of those other things. I think that's the most dangerous piece of a lot of this, because then it allows people to be a little more comfortable. My friend who moved here says, well, you know, yeah, we're going to better schools. You know, I'm not this suburban type person, but the parents out here care about the schools. You know, not, that's where it's very dangerous and very difficult. And that's where working, for me being at Shamrock with all these families and kids, and working and really coming to know these communities and what's going on in these communities and who these people are. For folks like us who are very privileged, that's just very, and sharing that with our neighbors and friends and all of them.
It's all just so hard to understand the mentality or get people to think, you know, what's good for the city, what is good for all of Charlotte. And I feel like at least back in the 70s and 80s, people were thinking about that, what benefits all of Charlotte. And they were proud, you know, people were proud of that. And you know, when people move from somewhere and they only look at, okay, which school has a 98% reading, it's in Valentine, so that's where I'm going. And, you know, then you get entrenched out here and, you know, maybe you've got adult kids who have moved to everywhere else and people don't see the value in making it good for everybody, you know.
Well, that's part why the affordable housing, sort of breaking up these cabins is important, because that is, that is, you know, people want to do the best.
Don't want to pay for
Doing
it.
what they think is best, even though they not really do. So.
Well, if your interest continues, I hope you'll come back next week where we're gonna really hash out all these suggestions and the wonderful things we've learned through the book and through our guests. And by the way, we have an extra book. If anybody hasn't read the book and wants to, I'm going to leave it here, so please take it.
And I'm happy to wait. If anybody happen to have a book they'd like to have signed,
Thank you so much.
I'm happy that I didn't stick around.